I'd like to give thanks to Rhondda for coordinating the series, and also to Real Pictures for hosting it, and also for the support that they have given me over the years, which has been a lot of support. And I've got a few introductory things that I'd like to say before I get into my actual lecture. About the slides, I have quite a number of slides. I'm using 2 projectors, and so only a few images I'll be able to go into in depth. The range includes early work, some student work, and mainly work from Aeguilibria and Galapagos, and it includes at the end some more recent work. And also I'm showing work by some other artists that I've been interested in for a long time. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them during my lecture. But if you have general questions, such as technical queries, I prefer that you ask those at the end. So if there is something that I mention that you want clarification of, I'd be happy to give that while I'm talking. Now I'd just like to say something about my working process, about my use of collage. Not all of my work, of course, is collage, but the majority of it is. And if I take a photograph of something, it's usually the object, or I'm usually concentrating on one thing and not the background, and so I tend to cut the background out. Could I have these slides on, Ian? Because I'd like to show a slide. If you could just turn them on. It's the, this one here. I suppose that perhaps we could have the lights out now. Yes, because I will start talking about particular slides. I should start. Yeah. If I'm speaking too quietly, could you please tell me, and I'll try and shout a little bit more. Well, this is just a proof sheet. It's a typical proof sheet. It has all sorts of bits and pieces, and I was mentioning before how I often like to cut things out. Well, actually, is it in focus? Yeah, that's in. This, for instance, is a side-long hung cup, and that's something they ended that from my last exhibition. Well, I just ended up slicing out the top and the sides and cleaning it up, removing this. But sometimes I actually use a photograph as a background. I'm not always cutting out background. This one here, for instance, which is a bit gloomy, and it's also side on. It's the background for ecological niche and a family of leaves sitting there. I'll show you that later. And these also are part of Prudentia. I'll be showing that one later. And this and that one, I think this photograph here is reversed. Is part of the extalionis, the law of retaliation. And I think that's about all I've used from, oh no, I've used this railing as well, not in a particular slide that I'm showing this evening. And that's about all. So I'm often just photographing the statue for the statue itself, and not really concentrating on the background at all. So the first part of the process of collage is isolation, and to quote Coleridge, we purify, separate, define, select, arrange and settle the nomenclature of communication. So we go from a separation or isolation process to an arranging or combining process at the end. And I use collage as a means of gaining clarity. You may feel that putting one photograph with another is actually going to cause confusion, but, well, sometimes it can, a deliberate kind of confusion as in images such as the unswept floor. But what I mean by clarity is not necessarily simplicity, but seeing things as I want to see them, so it's kind of a clarity of vision. And to quote Italo Calvino, if on a winter's night a traveller, the world is so complicated, tangled and overloaded that to see it with any clarity you must prune and prune. So, well, I may prune a branch off an apple and combine it with that of an orange or a pear, and the grafted result is a hybrid that may be more resilient to the frost. So it's a beneficial combination. That's how I tend to think of collage. Now, about the evolution of imagery from Galapagos to Aeguilibria, which is the title of this lecture, In my first major exhibition, which was held here, Rediscovering Galapagos, I rediscovered and reinterpreted aspects of natural history, and I used Darwin as a starting point, and his findings at the Galapagos Islands when he studied finches' beaks. And, so they're really about evolution and natural selection, camouflage, adaptation, things like that. And in Disarray and Aeguilibria, which I had here last year, I rediscovered and reinterpreted aspects of virtu moralis, or moral virtue, including man's attitude to nature. So if I was to think of a general overriding theme of both exhibitions, it would be man, nature, culture, or civilization, those three things in different combinations. It's a relationship of those things. In Galapagos, there was more emphasis on the natural, and then in Aeguilibria, more emphasis on the cultural, or man civilization. Often the relationship is one of conflict. So in Galapagos, we may have insects struggling to survive in a man-made world, and then in Aeguilibria, it's a conflict of moral virtues, for instance. Galapagos and Aeguilibria are both places, and Galapagos is, if you don't know, it's in the Pacific Ocean, it's near South America, it's fairly near the equator, and Aeguilibria is actually a place that doesn't exist. So before you consult your atlas, I'll tell you where it is. If it was to exist, it would probably be somewhere in the Mediterranean, in between Rome or Italy and Greece, because it's very much Mediterranean in feeling, whereas Galapagos is dealing with nature, and it's a kind of a scientific study, really. And to go to these places, you must travel, if you're going from New Zealand, over the sea. Of course, we're an island, and if you were travelling years ago, you would have gone in a boat. I get this right. This is a rather distorted view of the slide because the actual version of it is very tiny. And I'll just mention that I have a little display next door. Some of you may have seen it. I've set out a mantelpiece with 6 or 7 photographs laid out on that, and along this wall here are just Xeroxes from my notebooks that deal with, they show the development of an idea. Now coming back to this photograph, which is in its very enlarged state, it's called Voyage into Substance, and the title is derived from a book by Barbara Maria Stafford, and it discusses how nature was explored and perceived during the period of Enlightenment. And my image is also about a quest for discovery, and as Captain Cook sailed the uncharted Pacific in search of the great southern continent, my own journey is really, through my photography, is a journey without a map, because I don't really follow any particular direction in search of terra incognito. Now, oops, can I have the other slide projector on, please? That's a lot of light. It's the wrong way. This is from Stafford's book. It's an illustration by John Ross. It's called A Remarkable Discovery, and I thought I'd include it because it's quite similar with the boat. And there's this most amazing, I think it's some kind of iceberg, and there are a whole lot of people standing there, and there's an aperture in it. And I just wanted to say that I suppose to find something like this today would take a far greater pioneering spirit than would have been necessary, you know, in the days of Enlightenment or when Galapagos was discovered by Darwin, because just about everything has been photographed or recorded or documented in some way. However, there is still a great deal to be learnt by studying what has already been discovered or rediscovering it, as I did in Galapagos after Darwin. So this is actually an installation photograph. The actual piece that I'd like you to draw your attention to is in the centre. It's a letter rack, and it has photographic letters on it. So in my process of rediscovery, and also convincing the audience that I'd actually been to Galapagos, I made letter rack, and under false pretenses it contains photographic letters addressed to me at different places on the Galapagos Islands, like perhaps I was staying at Dolphin Hotel, and so I wanted the viewer to believe that I'd been there. And this is a slide of a 17th century letter rack by Waller and Vaillant. I'm just showing this so that you've got some kind of context to view my work in, because I've been looking at 17th century work, and I suppose with this type of thing, the artist was really trying to do the same thing as I'm trying to do in mine, which is convince the viewer that what they're seeing in painted illusion form is actually reality, although it isn't, of course. Secondly, it was important that the viewer believe that my photographs were the result of some kind of scientific study, and so this is evidence of my study. These butterflies are presented in shadow boxes, and I've just included this because this was the source photograph with all its cast caused by fluorescent light photograph that I took in the museum, and I've just cut the butterflies out, and I suppose that the telling thing really is the reflection on that centre butterfly on the left, because it just shows that it's actually a photograph, but when you see the real thing it's actually very convincing. So it's presented in a shadow box, skewered by pins and available for closer scrutiny and study. Then the next image is Morpho on Blue Iceberg, which is taking it a little bit further. It's a study of camouflage, because it shows the butterfly in the habitat that it has adopted for itself. It's a sort of picture that you could find in a biology book, although the different thing about it is that it's actually a set-up situation, and the butterfly, it's quite sad, but it's gone to alight on an iceberg, which actually is just a broken piece of hardboard. Oops, I didn't want to show that one just yet. Something's gone wrong with the slides. I just showed this one. It really backtracks a little bit, but I wanted to show how I started making these sorts of three-dimensional images. This was a work that I made while still at Elam, and I suppose it was the first really three-dimensional image that I made, and it's actually the face of Biddy Leyland, who's a photographer, and I've made it into a mask. Her eyes are actually cut out and her own eyes are placed behind, and it was meant to be an object that could be used, and the idea was that a person could have a mask of their own face with it's quite a straight expression. I hope I don't do this wrong again. And that's another angle of it. You can see that she's looking straight ahead, whereas with the other one it's looking slightly up from a different angle. This was presented in a shadow box, just as these ones are. So that's from, I think, 1979. It's another kind of camouflage, I suppose. I think these are slightly out of order. These are two works by Olivia Parker, and they're from her book Signs of Life, and I think her work was amongst the first that really interested me when I was a student at Elam. And the book comprises of a lot of 4x5 photographs of objects, quite mundane objects usually, and she presents them in boxes. Well, she actually photographs them in boxes, and photographs are just straight, but I really like the way that things were contained, and I think having looked at her work and people like Joseph Cornell, I was encouraged to do more work in boxes and use that as a form of presentation. I think that's upside down. That is actually upside down, but you can still understand it. It's a photograph of butterflies in quite a deep box that's lined in bricks. and it's called Butterflies of a Wing-Tape Pattern By. And it hints at the metamorphosis that is taking place by those butterflies to adapt to a city environment, which actually has ended up having a detrimental effect on them rather. This is by René Magritte. He's another person whose work I really enjoy, and it's called Memory of a Voyage, and everything has just become immersed or locked into stone, and I suppose I just wanted to show it in relation to these ones of mine that deal with camouflage. Could that one be focused? Yeah, it's better. This one's by William Hamilton, and it's from Stafford's book once again, Voyage into Substance. Specimens of volcanic matter found in the crater of Vesuvius. And it's a very detailed, accurate drawing, and if you think back to the time of Enlightenment, if a geologist or an artist was going away to record something, they wouldn't record it in an abstract, half-hearted way. They would take a lot of time and care to record it with incredible detail so that when they took it back to England or wherever they came from, somebody else looking at it would understand what it was all about. So this is this one here, and this next one. These photographs are called Natural Logic, the Vertical Principle, and I've used rocks and fossils and xeroxes of fossils and actual leaves and things, and I suppose it's just what I would present to a geologist. It doesn't belong to any particular exhibition, but it does somehow fit in with the types of images that are, especially in the first one. It's a constructed logic really, rather than being a real logic. And these ones here, I'm actually using some of the same photographs, and these ones date from about a year later. They're called Ancient Bowl 1 and 2. And on the left you have rocks and fossils in a marble bowl, and then on the right you have the same shapes are used, but you have a carved rock, and then you have a rock that's made out of a piece of flora, and then a rock that's made out of pattern on a wall. So I suppose it's like a cultural version of the natural one on the left, but I've tried to make them very similar to try and carry the idea from one to the other. And in these particular pictures, well, on the left-hand one, the right-hand one, I'm using rocks again in a symbolic way. This one's called Timepiece. Well, they're both called Timepiece. The one on the right is from Aeguilibria, and this one's from Galapagos. So it shows the progression of the idea. And I wanted to make a symbolic image of time. It's not the sort of clock that you would find a mechanism hiding behind. It's what you see, the mechanism is actually displayed, and these are actually geologically different rocks from different strata of earth from the Grand Canyon. And in a different way, these snails and spirals talk about time, because a spiral is a symbol of eternity. Coming back to camouflage again and following on from the snails, this one is the snails in their parlour. These snails managed to find a suitable habitat in a human environment, some kind of compromise, I suppose. Then, oops, I didn't mean to show that one yet. I've got quite a complicated slide show here, using two projectors in different times. This is from the Coats of Deception series, which also uses the idea of camouflage, but instead of it having to be insects that are having to disguise themselves, it's actually it's humans. These are coats that perhaps if you were walking along past a green leafy hedge, you would be able to disguise yourself. And and so on the left we have evergreen, and then next to that is the coat of self-defense, which is actually, it's quite bleached out, but it's incredibly pale. It's a judo coat, something that you would wear if you were playing judo. Then I think I've got another one. Oh, I've lost a slide somewhere. Oh, I'll just have to forget about it. I think I've realised what's happened. This is the ecological niche. And this is the other part of Coats of Deception, where we have once a supernova, which is a black coat with a red lining, and it's like the last phase of a star before it burns out and becomes a black hole. The coat is just about merging into the sky. Then there's China coat on the right. So taking this idea of camouflage further, I made this portrait of Dot Law, and like the leopard merging with scattered dappled light, Dot Law is camouflaged by a pattern of magnolia flowers that comes forward from the background and is enlarged and lands on her coat. And this particular picture has two viewing distances. From a distance, it just looks like a pattern, a confusing pattern of flowers. But if you were to investigate, if you were trying to capture the leopard, you would want to get closer and watch incredibly carefully. And I'm inviting the viewer to actually move up closer, and then once you are at a different proximity, you can see Dot merging out. And the particular bodily position that she's making is a physical manifestation of these beautiful, delicate little teapots that she was making out of tin and metal, that she was painting little flowers on it. So I suppose I feel that it's very much a complementary portrait that says on one hand something about camouflage, yet on the other hand it's a lot about Dot and her work. Then a similar, oops, oh, I just don't know what's happened here. Oh no, that's right. But the flattened space reminds me of the medieval concept of the hortus conclusus, or enclosed garden, as in Schöngo's painting here, Virgin of the Rose Arbor. And it was very much a medieval way of painting landscape, because the medieval mind could not cope with the immensity of nature. They feared the unknown. They expected that all sorts of dragons and demons would be lairing outside their gates, so they tended to portray a figure with a very flattened, closed-off background, which is similar to what I'm doing with Dot. But I use it not because I'm afraid of dragons and demons, but really mainly because I want to concentrate the viewer's attention on the foreground plane. This is just another example of it. It's by Giotto. He would use a rock to symbolize a mountain, for instance, rather than actually painting something of a massive scale. And this is the other portrait I was telling you about. It's a portrait of Peter Hawksby, who's a ceramicist, and he was making these ticks out of clay. That some of them were painted, and others were much plainer, and he's holding a couple of them, and I call this portrait légère de main, which means sleight of hand, which is what he seems to use when he conjures up these ceramic ticks. And once again, I've used the closed-off spatial recession. There is a wall behind him, and he is very much in the centre. I've tried to personalise the space by putting the ticks in the background, and when I photograph a landscape, which isn't terribly common, but every now and again I do, I generally label it with some kind of symbolism or significance, depending on what I wish to convey. It's a quote by Graham Greene that said, "The Congo is a region of the mind." that could mean that parts of the mind are as deep and impenetrable as the Congo, or the Congo exists only in the imagination. Well, coming back to Aeguilibria again, I told you that Aeguilibria doesn't actually exist, but this place obviously does, and it's actually Cornwall Park on a misty day. And it suited my concept of what Aeguilibria would look like, because I suppose I tend to idealize it in my own mind. And I think of it as being a very beautiful place, perhaps as the Greeks considered Arcadia to be. And so we have two trees here which somehow makes a kind of symmetry. Then there's another image which is the Botanical Gardens, which has quite a flat symmetry, just a very straight, I suppose it's incredibly contrived, but the exotic beauty really appealed to me, and I thought it would suit that place. So just thinking of that quote of Graham Greene's, the Congo is a region of the mind, I think it's quite suitable. The symbolic landscape is also the personal landscape. In some of my early work, like, and I apologise for the slide, it's about the worst one that I've got. It's view from my fortress. And in this photograph, the veranda of my home at Courtville has been reinforced with stone, and it's from the safety of my battlement, what my veranda has now become my battlement, that I view the world. And the view that you see outside is actually what I see from Courtville. It's just that I've changed the foreground by putting in that stone and using the window ledge as a place to put personal objects. The foreground and the background are very distinctly different realms, quite different to the way that Juan Gris, I suppose I wanted to show this as a contrast, because he tends to merge the background and the foreground by having these overlapping shapes and forms that the hillside goes through the frame and it becomes part of the composition. But in mine I was wanting to distinguish those planes quite a lot. The Impressionists were attempting to capture the mutability of aspect, that's the changing light, weather, and those effects of those conditions on objects. And so the obvious example is Monet with his haystacks, and this is one of snow. I think this is noon, then sunset. So the second image that I made, which used the same view, I suppose it's once again dealing with the Impressionists' idea of mutability of aspect, that I've chosen a different time of day. It's the early evening, well, yes, early evening. And in the foreground I've changed it to make it a nest of feathers, and it's called View from My Sanctuary. It's once again regarding a home as a safe place, and beyond is, I suppose it's the medieval concept of landscape once again. The Chinese also realized that the artist's attitude to scale is subjective, because these are very enlarged objects in the foreground. And I don't know who actually said these quotes, but the Wei River is as small as my window pane, or the cliffs of Chin are not so high as my balconies. So I suppose that they were talking about very distant objects. You knew that they were actually large, but when you see them from a certain perspective, they become very small. So dealing with that idea of distortion of scale, that's actually something that I use a lot in my collage work, because I feel that I don't have to always stick to one scale in particular. And coming on to a different series, I don't know if you realise that this part here is derived from this photograph. That's why I've showed it next. And it's quite common in my work for elements from one photograph to be used in another, and it may be several years later that I do use a photograph for a second time or even a third time. So in this one here we have the rocks and fossils that was used in the ancient bowl, and I've used this water a lot. You'll see it in my later images of So going back to that man-nature-culture relationship that I mentioned in the beginning, emphasis in most of the images that you've seen so far has been on the natural. Most of them come from the Galapagos exhibition. Conversation, which is the title of that image there, is about the conflict between the natural and the cultural, or nature is the figure on the right and culture is the figure on the left. Inspiration for the image came from actually seeing that relief. Oh, I think I've got a photo of it here. Oops, wrong one. I think I'll have to go back to this one. Oh dear, where's it gone? Sorry. It must be the next one. Yes, you can see the top photograph here. It's not very clear, it's quite small, and the top of the proof sheet's cut off, but that's what I saw in the Louvre, just in its plain state, and it immediately captured my attention. And I think that when I saw it, I just saw that it had other possibilities, and could see an idea in the stone, which was actually fairly large. I suppose those figures were almost, well, not quite life-size, but they were quite large. And the two figures seemed to be having some kind of conversation. And the word actually conversation occurred to me when I saw it, because they face each other. Then I thought, well, perhaps they're not actually having a conversation, because they're different creatures. One is a human, and then the other one is, I suppose, a natural animal type of figure. And perhaps they don't understand each other after all. So you have the language running across the top, and just these two figures. That was the basic element of it. Stafford writes that in the 19th century, nature and art increasingly came to express alien languages. And I think that's a very relevant quote, because it's just what I've tried to emphasize, that it's as though they originally spoke the same language, which runs continuously along the top, but as different dialects evolve with new figures of speech, fellow countrymen become aliens, and the line of rocks could be like a mountain range, which emphasizes the division, and more emphasis is given to the culture side than the natural side, which is cultures on the left, because I feel that today culture basically dominates things. In this dialogue, culture talks about art, because we have the Roman head, the alabaster head, the Greek vases, and also, I suppose, where art is usually housed, which is a city. So we have the clothing made up of a city, and there's a building construction going on. And what nature is actually talking about is flora and fauna. We have the creeper coming in from the top, the butterflies and birds. And I suppose the concept of infinity, because I see the sea as a symbol of infinity, and I suppose he's trying to interpret the augury in the sky, rather than thinking of bank balances type of thing. This is my translation of it, and every time I talk about it in a different way. And it's by no means the only translation, and I expect that you'll all have your own. I suppose that I consider the image of conversation to be as mutable as Monet's haystacks from noon to evening. It's the whole concept that can change. Or as Italo Calvino had his character Mr. Paloma say, every translation requires another translation, and so on. On the right you can see the source material for the photograph on the left, which is called Toucans Fighting Over the Last Frontier. This image, which shows a puppet performance of a woman who's holding these two toucans on her hands, and then you can see the audience in the foreground, has an ironic twist, because the puppeteer is actually struggling to maintain control over her puppets while the audience looks on. I see the images saying something about the exploitation and ruination of the toucan's habitat, which is the Amazon jungle, described as the last frontier in a Time magazine article I read. So these images actually have more of a political statement to say. We have preservation of the species and then evolution of the species. So although I'm actually talking about suppression of women, I suppose, or how it has been in history and in certain cultures, I'm continually referring it to things that are natural, like evolution, preservation, those sorts of terminology. These words are coming into it. And the preservation one deals with real pansies, and then from the left in the third one on the top row comes these artificial ones, and they intrude and end up obscuring the face of the Japanese woman. And it shows how attitudes in a culture tend to replicate themselves. And then in evolution of the species, the same photograph reoccurs in the centre, and it also shows an Egyptian woman who's masked with a veil, and then two other women from the 20s who have these pansies, which I see the three in the centre being hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. It's some kind of suppression basically, and then I suppose it's like a time sequence as well, because on the right is the modern woman it's more of an optimistic picture really, because I feel that a lot of these restrictions have been dropped, and the veil, which carries on from the left-hand image, has become a transparent veil, and you can actually see through it, and it's no longer such an obstruction and a confining, constricting device. Continuing with this theme of images in which I want to actually say something, I'm coming now to more recent work, Lex Talionis. This is a detail of it. I wanted to show how it looks up close, because these letters are all cut out of photographs. So I've done two photographs and then superimposed one on top of the other, cutting out those letters very painfully. The law of retaliation, if you can't read that, it's more clearly and deliberately made, the statement that I want to make. It's a compound image of both word and picture. The title is incorporated into the image as though it's an inscription, as though it was cut from a stone or cut from the same cloth. I didn't want the words to dominate the image too much, so I've made them just virtually a slightly different shade of colour and tone, so that you can still read the picture fully, but can at the same time read the words. And it's an interpretation of the biblical quote from Exodus, which in its reduced form says, "An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth." The concept of retaliation is age-old, but in these particular pictures I'm talking about a modern or contemporary tendency for acceleration, that a rock upstages a dart, or a dart upstages a rock, and then the rock is upstaged by a gun, which is upstaged by a machine gun, and the acceleration goes on and on. So instead of it being two equal forces like two rocks or two darts, I've included that idea of acceleration because things seem to be just working that way so much now. I'm just going to show some examples of precedents of this sort of thing, of incorporating words and images. This is by Fra Angelico, and it's you can see the figure to the right that's actually saying something. There's just a snake of gold words coming out of her mouth, and I don't know what it is, but it's probably some kind of lament at the death of Christ. And it's another one by Angelico, which has the inscriptions along the top and the bottom. It's a much more formal way of doing it. Doesn't intrude with the picture itself. Then it's a much faded slide of pages from a Japanese manuscript, which really shows the text, as I've tried to do in my photograph, really incorporated into the image, very much a part of it. Then I'm finishing up with one by Magritte, which the title is actually The Betrayal of Images, not what is written there. And he denies the scientific approach by incorrectly labelling the image and therefore calls reality into question, rather. So to continue on with the idea, this one here is using the same technique, although you can't read the words very clearly. They actually work a little bit like a daguerreotype, that the slide really shows them in such a poor light. If you see it from an angle, the writing just starts to illuminate, and like a daguerreotype, you can't necessarily look straight on at it. You have to look at it at a slight angle, perhaps, and the words just reveal themselves. This one's Creation in the Modern Western Illusion of Power. And so I want the title not to conflict with the image, but for it to be very much a part of it. Otherwise, the impact will be very greatly diminished. So in this photograph here, you have on the left, you have two rocks that are separated. Then on the right, they become joined and they make this combination, which really in itself is such a terrifying thing to comprehend. On the left, you have a rock, the large rock, that just seems to be floating like a cloud because the hand is behind it and it seems to be casting a shadow, and then it's a very relaxed hand. There's no antagonism in it at all. And then on the right is a hand that's actually really gripping the rock incredibly tightly, and the combination of the rock and the hand forms a shadow, which I see it as being a shadow of a person. And it seems to say that really man is responsible for this creation. So these two rocks in the right-hand one act as building blocks, that 1 + 1 makes 2. And the idea of building blocks also reoccurs in this next image, which is Prudentia endeavours to construct a model of Plato's ideal state, the building blocks of tombs of dead kings. Now in the first proof sheet that I showed you some little letters, and that's what has been cut out and used in this image here. So that this is part of a series of virtues and vices, deals with moral allegory, the struggle of virtue and vice, and Prudence constructs, instead of a mushroom cloud, the pyramid of so-called success, yet it is a tentative construction which, like the Tower of Babel, threatens to collapse. In the background is her model, tombs that edify powerful Egyptian kings. Her kings are equally as powerful in our own society. Will the pyramid grow taller or fall, is the question that she asks. Just as a comparison, this is Giotto's picture of Prudence on your left and fortitude or strength on the right. And often these moral figures were just depicted by some kind of symbol, like I think Prudence, I think she holds a mirror, I'm not too sure. I think she holds a mirror to herself, which is self-assessment, and fortitude has a pillar here which gives her strength, and she's holding a stick. So there really isn't much activity in these figures. They're just very static and symbolic. So my picture of fortitude, I've tried to create more of a sense of something actually happening. You can read the title there. Can you all read the title? Instead of me having to read it out. Fortitude battling with the winds of the Furies. So the presence of the vice is sensed, and the winds of the Furies is the vice, and fortitude is actually having quite a lot of difficulty maintaining stability in the face of pending demolition. So in these images, I'm dealing with classical ideas. I'm harking back to medieval times, looking at how virtues and vices were depicted in Renaissance times as well, yet I'm trying to imbue in them some kind of contemporary significance. Gaston Bachelard said, "Every value evokes its opposite and is in constant struggle with it, so the virtue always has a vice that is playing with it." I think This is a picture by Botticelli of Fortitude, just to show another version of it. Then on the left is Justice and Injustice by Giotto from the Arena Chapel. And Justice holds two little figures, and typically she was personified as holding scales or weighing up the pros and cons of things. And in my version, Justitia, wounded by the sword of liberty, au-dessous de la mêlée, so above the battle, it's as though there has been this battle going on, and Justice is actually wounded by Liberty, who is normally on his side, so there's just an ironic twist to that one. And this is another source image. This is what the Renaissance artists would have been looking at, Cesar Ripa's Iconologia. I think that's how you say it. And it's tragedy. There's a bit more activity in that one. It's another one. Temperance, taking with her the object regulating time and motion study. And here she is fighting with death. It's about the regulation of our lives by the clock, amongst other things. I'm just going through these quite quickly, not to dwell on any one in particular. Logic is trying to understand mathematics and precise measurement, and logic is struggling with the science of decipherment. There's a series of 9 of these. And on the wall there I've written down ideas for further ones that I haven't made yet, which actually just start off as a title, and then I go through all the list of titles that I've formed, and sometimes I may write 2 or 3 versions of titles. Then I choose the one that I like best and think of how I can work an image around these. That's the particular way that I've worked with these ones, although a lot of the other work happens much more spontaneously. But I find that with these, when I'm referring to the past, I need to really work it all out before I actually do it, because it involves a lot of play acting. Then the house of Aeguilibria and disarray. It's as though this wind is blowing through her house and disrupted these objects. So there's chaos in the house of where you would expect balance to be. This is the last one from that series that I'm going to show. Philosophy, trying to find the reason in the Codex Naturae. Now she consults the book of nature, searching for the reason for existence. The book has in place of words nature. Her leaves woven into the leaves of the book, open at a page waiting to be read and interpreted. I've cut out the lines where you would expect to see lines of writing, and then the leaves are woven into that. Although I actually fear that the book has become archaic and a correct translation of it is yet to be found. Perhaps its history is dying within the covers. Like violets and forget-me-nots, one often finds abandoned in musty old books. So, on one hand, I suppose I'm suggesting that we should look to nature and for finding out the reason. Then on the other hand, perhaps there's a bit of fear that it's too late because the book has become musty and no one actually knows how to decipher it anymore. In the above series, the ones that I've just shown you, I've used myself or parts of myself like a hand to personify mythical persons or ideas. In this next photograph, it's titled Flora, the ancient goddess of flowers. I was prompted to take the photograph after I'd made this arrangement on my mantelpiece, which is what I usually do when the hydrangeas are out, because I like them so much. And there is a little head on the mantelpiece, a doll's head, that has a flower hat. And I just thought that I'd make a silly portrait of myself. No one else was there with a flower hat, and it actually ended up looking quite serious, and so I thought it didn't actually have any whimsical, silly quality to it. And then quite a few months later I came across the title, Flora, after recalling such images as Botticelli's Primavera with the figure of Flora in it. So I didn't actually think of it as being called flora. It was once I really thought of what can I call it. So I was trying to put a name to it all the time, and then I think it's really appropriate what I've come up with. This is not an image of personification, but like the delayed title of Flora, the image conception was delayed. It's a combination of lilies with figures, which was actually suggested by the proof sheet. Now, it's this one here. I've actually cropped off the bottom of it, and it's the last frame, and so it's only 3/4 there. And so I thought, oh, well, I just can't use it. What can I do with it? Because it's just half of me's gone. There's this funny light strip down the middle of my face there, and there's just a fragment of me there, and all of Julian is there, and I thought, it just doesn't seem very fair. And then I looked at this image. I looked at this and I thought, well, it just seemed to be a perfect combination. So I cut it out around the flowers, and where the black was, incorporated this other pale area. So I just wanted to show this one because it explains something of my working process, how sometimes ideas occur prior to the photograph being taken, as with the series that I showed of Virtues and Vices. But with this one, it really was after I'd taken the photograph that the idea occurred. Also, how an understanding of a photograph can grow and change, just as I really didn't think about Flora as a title until I thought about it for 6 months. So to look at a few possible meanings of this photograph, I've actually called it Untitled. The photograph has something to do with lilies. Perhaps it has some significance to me because my second name is Lillian. There's something about a relationship, its tones of lightness and dark. These are just looking at different ways that the photograph could be seen. It could be called Hemerocale, the name of a daylily, which means Greek for beautiful for a day, or perhaps another title, which is something Julian suggested, was No Need to Gilt the Lily, because it's not necessary perhaps that the lily in itself is perfection, and so why do you need to paint it or gild it to make it even more perfect? So the image exists perfectly well in its simplicity, so still haven't quite decided on the title, but I think the last one will probably be it. Now the last group of photographs I will show you this evening are examples of my most recent work. I've given them to date the general title of Patterns of Nature, Designs of Culture. And the first two are part of my Aeguilibria exhibition, so you've seen those already. You can see the titles Hydrangea Cup and Punga Cup. And I suppose this one relates to Flora because it once again uses hydrangeas. But in this one, it also relates to the idea of camouflage as well, because the cup merges with the background, although when you actually see the real thing, it does actually stand out from the background. It's been separated by about 1/2 inch, and the shape of it's also been cut out, so when you get a strong light cast on it, it creates a shadow. So I'm really, and then in Punga Cup, I've removed all of the background. It was some inverted dead punga leaves that had been turned up the other way because the shape just suggested a cup shape to me. And so I was really inspired by the thing itself. And when I look at Punga Cup, I think of a quote by Clarence Glacken from Traces on the Rhodian Shore that says that man is the modifier of nature. And I suppose that I see it and I think, well, I accept that man is the modifier of nature, that there is very little around that is in its virgin state. That you can go to a native forest and you find a pine tree, and everything has somehow been infiltrated by something else. And I'm incorporating the two. I see it as a compromise, really. It's also about how culture is a placed experience by the observation of models rather than the real thing. we tend to regard a picture, or in this case an object, more readily than we do the real thing. So after doing those first two, I moved on to do these more recent ones. We have a water lily glass on the right, and then on the left heavy water. And I suppose heavy water may seem like a strange title for it, but the water itself is actually the sort of water that you see on a dull, gloomy day, that sometimes water can be incredibly bright and sparkly, and then on another day it can just be very dark and dense. And heavy water is actually a type of water used in nuclear reactors as a moderator. And then after that one I made Pacific water, which is, like I was talking about before, full of life and vitality and movement, and instead of just an upward downward movement, very heavy at the bottom, it seems to spiral and has much more lively quality. And this is the whole series, which is called Water Glass, and we have in the centre Water of Confusion, which is a faceted glass. So I've tried to choose the shape of the glass to emphasize something about the quality of the photograph. So the exuberance of the spirally one, the very dense and heaviness of the heavy water one, then the faceted quality of light that really reflects a lot of colours and movement, and then either side of that is uranium sunrise, plutonium sunset. So having done the first one, I conceived of the idea of making a series of them that collectively they make a statement about the use of the Pacific as a place of nuclear experiment in a dumping ground. They also discuss the Oriental idea of immensity symbolized by the miniature, the vastness of something like a waterfall and a lake being confined and compressed into something very small and miniature, like a glass. It's reduced to the contents of glass, like the Chinese penjing or bowl landscape, and there's a little illustration of that next door. I suppose perhaps why I do this is because the idea of infinity is something that's really hard to conceive of. I remember being told about the universe and how it's actually something so vast and huge that you can never actually reach the end of it. You can go as far as you like and you're never actually going to stop. And so by reducing everything, it becomes something that you can comprehend and conceive of and understand. I'm just showing some background. Whoops, didn't want to show that one yet. These are two, I've just used these as a reference. This is Achilles slaying Penthesilea. So in Greek decoration, they would have perhaps an epic event or a domestic one, like this woman and her servant. And there was usually some kind of narrative quality. But I wanted to show these ones because they relate to the next two. The lekathos, which is the shape, it's a Greek shape. The lekathos was actually a vessel that would carry oil or water. Could they be, focused a bit? I think of these images as being timeless alibis because they belong to no particular time, although there is a very definite Greekness to them and a classicism through the shape, but the content is, I suppose, could be taken from any particular time. There is no narrative to these pictures. They are more trying to express an emotion more than anything else. They also reiterate the theme that is so constant through my work of order versus chaos, or virtue versus vice, or things in combat or battling with each other. So you have the perfection, the order and symmetry of the Greek outline counteracted by the relative chaos of the internal pattern. And the title of the left one is, I haven't quite decided, but I think it's Before the Fall. And it's as though it really shows a kind of a paradise with flowers and insects, birds, and there is a layering of foliage, and then similarly with this one, which it looks very flat in the slide, but if you look at them next door, you will see that there's quite a lot of depth, and I think I'd call that one on the right The Romantic Rebellion, which is a title from a book by Newton. In it he says the following, which I feel describes well what is happening in these lekythos, and it's from the title called Conflict. Opposing forces, equally balanced, produce an equilibrium that may superficially resemble the tranquil equilibrium that classical art invariably attempts to discover. The universe can only achieve stability by virtue of thrust and counter-thrust, of centripetal and centrifugal forces, eternally cancelling each other out, of never-ending processes of birth leading to death, growth to decay. Exuberance is balanced by disciplines. So I feel that these images probably stem from my own seeking of a balance between order and chaos, and between nature and culture. I also like the simplicity of them because they have the background removed altogether, so it's a concentration of the object as well. And as with Dot, it has two viewing distances. You see the outline from a distance, and you come up, and then you're invited to move through the foliage, and so they have a kind of a depth. Now I have one more slide. The final image is the unswept floor. So with these ones you were encouraged to move through the overlapping foliage, and with the unswept floor you are invited to excavate the debris accumulated by the layers of time. And I wish I had a detail of that, because it would show the kind of complexity that is achieved in the final image, which is actually slightly cropped. The four images are laid out in more geometrico, to borrow a term of Spinoza's, which means presented in a systematic order. And I wanted it to suggest a kind of a history moving from the left, relatively uncluttered mosaic, which is actually in Rome, the Vatican. It's called the unswept floor, and it's bits and pieces that have been left over from a banquet. Then the next image is of a beach and has bits of seaweed and things like that scattered over it, and parts of the left-hand image have become incorporated into the next one, and so on, until in the final right-hand one you have bits of the beach, you have bits of the mosaic, then the bits of paper and other things accumulated. So it's as though all of these objects have become accumulated on the floor of time, and you have to really delve deeply in the final one to actually reach the floor, which is actually cracked under the weight of all of these things that have been accumulating. And I suppose that's what I'd like to finish with. It's my last one. I don't have any particular conclusion, but I'd welcome questions if any of you have them now. Surprised no one asked me anything while I was talking. I didn't understand why.
Megan, I wanted to ask you about Aeguilibria. Is that your own island, or is it from another source?
No, it doesn't exist.
But did you create the idea of it, or that's what I'm asking?
Yes, well, I suppose it is a place in a way, because there were the photographs of the landscape, but there was also the House of Aeguilibria and Disarray, which, so it's a person in that case, and it's also a concept as well of balance, everything being equal and symmetrical. But equilibrium is, with the AE, is the correct word, but Aeguilibria with an IA on the end is, I suppose, making it into a name. Yes. Are there any more questions? Oh well.
No, you stunned us all.
Oh. I'm sure there must be something else to ask, like what sort of film I use, or.
I wanted to know where you photographed that water, and what sort of film that was.
It was Cibachrome, and it was just different parts of the whiter matter, different weather conditions, and lighting. no particular place. But it's amazing how much it changes.
How do you superimpose the different elements of your images?
Well, I don't try and do it in the darkroom. I don't try and make it a seamless thing. I actually really like the overlapping and build up of one layer on top of another. So I use glue and combine them that way. So I think that the surface of a photograph is so flat and two-dimensional and machine-like that it becomes very monotonous, and I like to be able to introduce something else into it that has a bit of variation in texture, and sometimes I scratch the surface or draw onto it with ink or paint onto it as well, just to relieve that monotony, especially of the Cibachrome, which is so cold a medium. It's very smooth and shiny and reflective, and I like to try and get away from that somehow. It's also why I tend to overexpose a little bit. I use a positive film just to try and get rid of some of the contrast and make things softer. And I use polychrome film, which is quite flat as well, and has a particular kind of grain structure that is arranged in stripes. Yeah. I thought somebody else would have some questions about.
I've got a question.
Okay.
You're using cutout techniques a lot,
Mm.
and you have mentioned Matisse.
Oh, Matisse. No, I suppose I've looked at his work just like I've looked at a heck of a lot of other work, because I tend to spend most of my time in the library.
I noticed two of your pieces were direct references. One was the Coat Against the Stars, which was very much a copy of Icarus.
I haven't seen it.
Black body floating against a sea of blue stars with a bright red heart.
Oh, really?
Which translated into photographic image.
Oh, I've actually seen.
Almost precisely.
I've seen it quite a close similarity with one of Dali's called Day and Night, and he had a figure in a very similar box, which I think there was the day figure may have had a white clothing on it, and then the black. There was a night figure that was quite dark and gloomy, but I must look that source up, but I haven't seen it.
And your other one was quite an interesting reference to, I've forgotten what the title was now, it was who it was reading a book.
Oh, philosophy.
Yes, the patterns of the leaves and the way the leaves were distributed over the page again resembled Matisse's cutouts of large foliages, and the way he recreated gardens with his cutouts was again almost a very close resemblance.
Yes.
And it was interesting that you arrived at those sorts of designs by your method.
Oh, well, it was very easy because I was actually cutting around real things, whereas he was just cutting out shapes. And so it's surprising that he arrived at what he arrived at. I tend to follow the outline of something rather than just cut very
You never just tear at random and see what happens?
Well, it can't actually tear Cibachrome. You can't rip it, it's so incredibly strong. And which is another thing that is very important in my collage, because although I showed you that early one of the mask fan, that was printed onto black and white paper and it was hand-coloured. And it was very frustrating at the time to try and do something like that, because the paper cracks where it's folded, and I was going to make a cyanotype of it, contact printed onto paper that had been sensitised with, chemicals to try and get away from that cracking. But as soon as Cibachrome came along, and I was working here at the time, that I immediately found that there was something so different about it that I'd never discovered with any other photographic material, that it really enabled me to cut it out so cleanly and form shapes that had a resilience of their own. And so you can't just tear it like a piece of paper. It really is a very smooth, monotonous, machine-made product that you have to really violate to get any kind of handmade quality to it.
That's something basic. How do you get both sides the same?
Just by using a piece of paper that's folded I draw it on one side and then fold it and cut it out,
Yes.
and then draw around my outline, and then yeah.
What have you used as a scalpel and erase?
No, I use scissors, just sharp scissors, usually. It's only if I'm cutting some internal shape, like a hole from inside something else, that I use a knife. But,
What would you say the role of beauty in your images was?
I think that's quite a strong role. I did a picture that's called The Question of Beauty, and I was looking at one side at butterflies that were very beautiful, and then on the other side there was stick insects with wings, and I found in a museum in Christchurch they had these drawers full of insects, and you could just pull one drawer out, you pull another drawer out, and I found opposite was these two things. And so I was just thinking about the way that beauty is so much a subjective thing, and it's a personal thing, that what I think is beautiful, and I try to make things beautiful, is certainly what you probably don't think is beautiful. So I make things for myself initially, and if other people think that they're beautiful, well, that's great. But I feel that I can still make comment about things that I'm unhappy with today, like some of the ones that comment about demolition, through making beautiful images. I don't feel that you have to be doing something that is the same size as a billboard and that is printed in very bold black and white letters that says you mustn't do this or you must do that. I don't think it's necessarily going to make any difference, that you can have as much influence on someone by making a subtle comment that perhaps it may just infiltrate their awareness or understanding in some way, and that little subtle penetration can make a lot of difference. And so that's how I tend to work. But yes, I suppose I do try to make things that have appealing qualities, because I try to seduce the person to look at it, and then they may decide that they're not interested in it once they get up very close, but I hope that they will keep looking and find something else that will interest them, because I think that most of my work I try to put more than one layer into it, and whereas this evening I was going through the slides very quickly and perhaps just talking about one significant aspect of a photograph and ignoring a whole host of other ideas that were really in it. Yes, so I try to create layers of ideas.
Do you reproduce any of your photographs? Like, do you make a number of a particular photograph, or do you like sort of the one-off type thing?
They're basically one-off. I have in the past been asked, for instance, in an exhibition, if something has been sold and someone else is interested in it, I have made another copy, or in one case, 2 other copies. That I say that they're a copy, but once I get into the darkroom again, it's another day, it's another evening. My eyesight is different, and the way that I look at colours is different. So it generally doesn't work out to be the same. But yes, I sometimes make other versions. I suppose that's a better word. But I generally don't go to the trouble, because the spark of it is gone once I've made it. And it becomes quite a chore to actually have to do something again. Yet on the other hand, if somebody really wants it, I will. I've enjoyed actually getting the ideas together, because I don't usually have to think of them in such a logical way, that I work on one thing at a time, and I haven't had to think across such a spectrum for such a long time and put things together in some kind of clear way that you can understand it. Well, looks like that's all that everyone wants to ask.
Well, you seduced me with your images, and I'm sure. Thank you very much, Meg. It was great.
ideas for over a year, and I put it together, just working night and day in a matter of months. But
It seemed to me to be an awful lot of work.
it was. I made myself really sick for months after it, actually. But I can't have a show every year. It's mainly the ideas, I suppose, getting the ideas together and finding time to do it, because each thing is so time consuming that I would prefer to work in a concentrated period of time rather than do work consistently. I think of the ideas consistently, but actually physically printing them and framing them, I tend to do that.
But you don't do your own framing.
Well, I supervise the framing and choose the framing and cut nets. I do part of it, but I don't construct them.
Because it does seem to me to be an awful lot of work. So you're not having an exhibition this year?
I've actually booked one for the end of the year.
End of the year.
Yes. So
Oh, well.
I have to start working on it.
Okay, thanks.
So you didn't ask your questions after all.
No, I saved them for later. It was very, very thought-provoking.
Oh, that's good.
Mostly excellent. You were talking at one point about change of scale.
Yes.
View from your
Fortress.
and view from your sanctuary.
Yes.
Yeah. You said you mucked about with scale there.
Yes.
Does that relate to like the glass shots, like was it waterfall?
Waterfall glass.
Yeah. You said you were talking about infinity there. Is that a sort of similar scale change that you're?
Well, it's a greater scale change, so I'm reducing something very large to something that's small. But I'm basically not talking about the same relationship of scale, but the fact that scale change has gone on. Because obviously any photograph of something is a miniaturization of it. But I was mainly talking about a concept there rather than a comparative scale of some large things combined with little things, which is what I was talking about in relation to view from the fortress.
So there are different sorts of scale relationships.
Yes. Yeah. You should have asked me these when I was wanting to ask these.
Shy. You stunned everybody. You absolutely killed them.
Oh, well, I'm glad you enjoyed it anyway.
I have a problem, like, I muck about with photos at home, but I always hit this stumbling block. How do you get over your stumbling blocks?
Just by keeping on working it. It's too much for me to go into that. It's basically that, are you going down this way? No, I'm not. Sorry. It's basically that I have stumbling blocks too.
So you just sort of follow the idea.
I keep an idea and I may do something with it 2 years later. I may do something with it.
You write how your ideas sound, do you?
Yes.
Have you been around the corner?
Well, that's just like quick space.
Yeah. That's just,
You don't sort of realise what they're like until you actually look at them, you know, on the slide, they're just still two-dimensional.
yes.
Did you see this one?
Yes.
I think you're very well. Oh, good. Thanks. I'm nervous, but I didn't sort of shut up.
I was just going to ask you something that was
From the two slides.
completely around.
To get through so many slides, just going for one, it's not really too much. I like to do it in person.
So I thought it was very inspiring. It's not inspired,
It'd be good with Jennifer here. You'll have someone else, another woman in the place.
Yeah, that's true. And I was really enjoying it.
Yeah.
I really am having such a good time. I really like being up at university finally. I'm having the best time I've had.
Actually, you seem very happy.
It's nice and good.
If I turn the slide on.
Can I ask you something totally irrelevant?
Yeah.
Where did you get your earrings from?
Oh, they're from London.
I should have known.
Somebody bought them for me. They're really
Unusual,
unusual.
okay.
Yours are unusual too.
Titanium.
Yes, are they by Nick Charlton?
Help?
From-
I don't know.
Fingers. They look like lip.
They're actually not, no, I got mine in Piha.
Oh.
In some funny little shop I found in Piha, and they're like about a third of the price that they are in the city. I don't know. Yeah, they are nice. They're so nice to wear, they're so light. Yeah, I was just looking at them, beaming off them.
How do your store works like that?
Oh, I don't actually store many because I don't have many.
Do you sell a lot of the stuff here?
Well, I don't make much. I mean, this is a number of years' work. It's not all of it, but